Hello, my friend. Welcome to the long quiet. Tonight you are a lighthouse keeper at Yaquina Head on the Oregon coast, walking up to the tower in the long Pacific fog in December 1923. By a little after 4 o'clock on a December afternoon in the year 1923, on a high stone headland on the Oregon coast, where the Yaquina Headlight had stood since 1873. The keeper began the small, steady walk up the path to the tower. His name was Edmund. He was 51 years old. He had been the keeper at Yaquina Head for 19 winters. He had come to the station as the assistant in 1904, when the then keeper, a man named Dawson, had been still in his middle years, and the tower had been a place of 3 families, and he had been promoted to head keeper in 1909, when Dawson had retired to a small farm inland, and he had been the head keeper for 14 years now, through 3 assistants, 2 wives at the keeper's cottage, and 1 daughter who had grown up here and moved away. The path from the keeper's cottage to the tower ran about 300 yards along the high grassy crown of the headland in a slow rising curve. It was made of crushed shell and packed earth, and it had been walked in 19 years by Edmund's boots, so many thousands of times that he could have walked it in the deep dark, with his eyes closed and not put a foot wrong. He walked it now in the slow gray light of the December afternoon, which was not really afternoon anymore, so much as the long thinning hour before true dusk that comes early on the Oregon coast in winter. The fog was coming in. It had been gathering since noon, far out on the water, in the long, pale way that Pacific fog gathers when there is a thaw in the air against a colder sea. By 2 o'clock, the horizon had gone from blue to gray to white, and by 3 the white had begun to drift inland in slow, soft sheets that lay first across the surf, and then across the rocks at the base of the headland, and then, by the time Edmund left the cottage, were beginning to fold themselves up around the high, grassy crown where he walked. He could feel the fog now on his face. It was not a cold fog, particularly. It was the soft, damp fog of a Pacific winter, which is gentler than the dry, biting cold that comes from the high mountains inland. He walked at his own pace, He carried in one hand his small leather satchel of personal items, which he always brought up to the tower for the night watch. A thermos of coffee, 2 sandwiches that his wife Helen had wrapped that morning, his small leather notebook in which he kept the keeper's log entries and his own private notes, a folded handkerchief, and the small worn copy of the New England poet Whittier that he had been reading off and on for the past 3 months. In his other hand, he carried his small kerosene lantern, unlit yet, which he would use later to walk back down the path after the night watch ended and his assistant Carl took over at midnight. The lantern was an old brass lantern with a glass chimney and a small loop handle. It had been his father's lantern on a fishing boat out of Astoria back in the 1880s. His father had given it to him when Edmund had taken the assistant post at Yaquina in 1904, and Edmund had carried it on the path up to the tower for 19 years now. It had a small dent on its base where the previous keeper Dawson had dropped it once on the iron stairs of the lamp room in 1907 in a hurry. The dent had become familiar. Many things had become familiar. He walked. The path turned slow to the right, and the tower came into view above him. The tower was 93 feet tall. It was built of brick, painted white, with a black gallery at the top from which the lantern room rose. And the lantern room itself was the small, round, glass-walled chamber that held the first-order Fresnel lens. The Yaquina Head light had been famous for its lens since it had been installed in 1873. The lens had been made in Paris in the shop of Henry Lepaute and shipped around Cape Horn in 19 crates and assembled here on this headland by 2 French engineers who had spent the winter of '72 living in a small wooden cabin near where the keeper's cottage now stood. The lens was, in its way, a kind of presence on the headland. It had been here longer than any man who served it. Edmund stopped briefly on the path. He looked up at the tower in the slow drift of incoming fog. He did this most evenings. He had thought after the first few years that he would stop doing it, that the tower would become so familiar that he would no longer pause to look at it. He had been wrong about that. The tower had not become less than itself. It stood against the pale gray of the Pacific afternoon, white and patient and tall, with the small black gallery at its crown, and the small round dark shape of the unlit lantern room above the gallery, waiting for him. He walked on. The path met the small stone steps that ran the last few yards up to the base door of the tower. He climbed the steps slow, in the way he climbed everything now. In his 52nd year, his knees made the small, low, quiet sounds that 51-year-old knees make. He did not mind. He had been climbing this set of steps for 19 winters. The knees had earned the small sounds. He took the key from the inner pocket of his oilskin coat. The key was iron and heavy and worn smooth on the ball from the long use of many keepers. He fitted it to the lock of the iron door at the base of the tower, and he turned it. And the lock made the small particular clack it always made. And he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside the tower came out to meet him. It was the air the tower always had, cool and slightly damp, and smelling of brick and lime wash, and the faint, sweet lower note of the kerosene that lived in the lamp room high above, and that, over 50 years, had worked its slow, patient way down through the long, vertical hollow of the tower's interior. Edmund breathed it in. He had been breathing it for 19 winters. He set the satchel and the lantern on the small wooden bench just inside the door, where keepers had set such things since the tower had been built. He took off his oilskin coat and hung it on the iron hook beside the door. He took the satchel back up. He left the kerosene lantern on the bench for now. He would not need it until the walk down later. He looked for a moment around the small round room at the base of the tower. It was a room of perhaps 12 feet across. It had a stone floor that had been worn smooth by 50 years of feet. It had a small iron desk along the wall opposite the door, with a barometer and a small clock, and the keeper's logbook set out in its careful order. It had a brass speaking tube that ran up the tower to the watch room, in case some emergency in the lamp room required calling down to the assistant. It had, in the corner, the small black iron stove that the keeper on cold winter night watches would sometimes light. although Edmund did not light it tonight because he was not going to spend the night watch at the base of the tower. He would spend it where he always spent it, at the watch room near the top. He glanced at the barometer. The barometer was reading high and steady. There was no storm coming. There was only the fog. The gentle, long Pacific fog, which would lie on the coast through the night and would burn off, perhaps by mid-morning, when the weak December sun came up over the inland mountains and warmed the air enough to lift it. He noted the reading in the logbook in his small, careful hand. December the 12th, 1923. Barometer 30.02 and steady. Wind out of the southwest, very light. Fog incoming. Lamp will be lit at 4:30. He set the pen down. He turned to the stairs. The stairs were iron. They went up the inside of the tower in a long, slow spiral. There were 114 of them from the base to the watchroom. Edmund had climbed them many thousands of times. He knew each landing of them. He started up. He climbed unhurried. He held the iron rail with one hand and the satchel in the other. The iron was cold but not freezing, the way iron was inside the tower in winter. Even when the brick of the tower itself had been holding the small warmth of the December sun all day. Through the few narrow brick-set windows at intervals up the tower, he could glimpse in passing the slow, pale spread of fog, now drifting across the headland outside, and the small distant gray of the sea beyond it. The light through these windows was the pale silver-gray light of a Pacific coast afternoon, dissolving into the deeper gray of a foggy dusk. He climbed. He thought of nothing in particular as he climbed. He thought, perhaps, of the kerosene tanks above, which had been refilled by Carl that morning. He thought, perhaps, of the wet, which he had trimmed himself yesterday after the morning watch. He thought, perhaps, of the small fact that this was the second of 3 weeks of fog season on the coast, and the foghorn at the small fog signal building down on the rocks would be running tonight. The long, slow, steady note of it heard from up here, as a kind of soft, distant heartbeat behind the fog. He thought of these things in the small, slow way of a man who has done a thing well for 19 years and who no longer needs to think about it forcefully. the work simply being done. He reached the watchroom at perhaps 4:20. The watchroom was the small chamber just below the lamp room itself. It had a small iron desk, a chair, a low bench along one wall, a small stove, a small window on the seaward side, the brass speaking tube going down to the base, and a small iron stair that led the last short distance up through a hatch to the lamp room above. Edmund set his satchel on the bench. He took off his cap and hung it on the peg by the desk. He went to the stove. The stove had been banked when he had finished the morning watch. Some of the coals were still warm. He opened the firebox, added 2 small pieces of fur, and the fire took. He set the kettle on. He turned then to the hatch above him. He climbed the small iron stair, ducking slightly through the hatch, and he was in the lamp room. The lamp room was beautiful. He had thought this for 19 winters and had never grown used to it. It was a round chamber of brass and glass, perhaps 12 feet across, surrounded on all sides by the great Fresnel lens. The lens was a tall barrel of cut crystal panels, set in a brass frame, and it rose around the lamp at its center to a height of perhaps 8 feet. The panels of the lens caught the failing light of the December afternoon and broke it into 1,000 small, soft refractions on the brass framing. And the brass itself, polished by 19 years of keepers' hands, glowed a soft, warm gold in the silver fog light that came through the lantern room windows from outside. At the center of the lens stood the lamp. The lamp was an old kerosene mantle lamp, the same one that had been installed at Yaquina in the early 90s when the original whale oil setup had been retired. It was a complicated little assembly of brass tubes and gauze mantles and a wick that fed kerosene up from the tanks below. Edmund went to it. He inspected the wick. The wick was good. He opened the small valve and let the kerosene begin to feed. He took a long match from the brass tin set against the wall. He struck the match against the wall at the small worn place where every keeper had struck every match for 50 years. And the match caught with its small bright flame, and he held it to the wick. The wick took. It took with the small, soft pop of a properly trimmed wick. The flame stood up small and clean and bright. Edmund adjusted the burner. He pulled the glass chimney down over the flame. The flame settled into the steady, tall yellow of a properly burning kerosene lamp. He waited a moment. He adjusted the burner a hair further. The flame went from yellow to white. The white of clean combustion. And he was satisfied. He stepped back. He went to the brass cabinet that held the clockwork mechanism that drove the rotation of the lens. He took the iron lever from its bracket and set it in the slot in the cabinet and began to wind. The weight came up in long, slow turns, each turn weighing more than the last. When the weight had been raised to its top position, he set the lever back. He released the lock. The lens, which had been still, began to turn. It turned in the long, patient revolution that it had been built to turn. The Yaquina light flashed every 20 seconds. 2 flashes, then a small interval, then 2 flashes, then a small interval. A signature that mariners knew from charts. As the lens turned, the 2 bright bars of light that issued from its flanks began their slow sweep out into the long, pale gray of the fog beyond the lantern room window. The fog, just outside the windows, lit up. The fog lit up in long, soft, luminous fans that swept slowly around the tower as the lens turned. And each fan of light moved outward into the long, pale ocean of fog beyond the headland, and lost itself there, and was replaced by the next fan, and the next. The fog itself became a luminous thing, lit from within by the slow turning of the lens. Edmund stood for a moment in the lamp room and watched. He had been watching this for 19 winters. He still loved it. He stepped to the small door that led out from the lamp room onto the gallery. He opened it. The cold of the gallery came in at him in a slow, soft wave. And with the cold came the small, low note of the foghorn. From the fog signal building down on the rocks at the base of the headland. The foghorn had begun, presumably while he had been climbing the stairs. It made its long, slow note, perhaps 3 seconds long. And then there was a small silence of 57 seconds. And then the note came again. Edmund stood on the gallery and listened to one full cycle of it. He nodded to himself. He had been hearing this same foghorn for 19 winters. He could tell by the small, particular timbre of its note that the diaphone in the signal building was working at full pressure tonight, which was a thing the assistant on the fog signal duty would have checked and set before dusk. Everything was in order. The light was lit. The lens was turning. The foghorn was sounding. The night watch could begin. He stepped back inside and closed the lamp-room door. He went down through the hatch to the watchroom. The watchroom was warmer now. The stove had taken hold, and the small iron sides of it had begun to glow a faint, dim red. And the kettle was beginning to make its first small ticking sounds. Edmund sat down on the chair at the desk. He set the satchel on the bench beside him. He opened it. He took out the thermos of coffee. He set it on the desk. He took out the 2 sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, and he set them on the bench. He took out the small leather notebook and the worn copy of Whittier. He set them too. He left the handkerchief in the satchel. He poured a small, careful measure of coffee into the small tin cup that was the cap of the thermos. He drank. The coffee was warm. Helen, his wife, had filled the thermos at 3 o'clock when he had left the cottage to start his walk-up. She knew his rhythms. She had been the keeper's wife for 14 years, since they had married in 1909 in a small ceremony in the town of Newport down the coast. And she had become, over those 14 years, very good at filling thermoses in such a way that the coffee was still warm at 6 o'clock when he wanted it at the watchroom. He thanked her in his mind. He drank again, small and careful. The lamp on the desk beside him burned steady. The lens above him in the lamp room turned slow. He sat for some time without doing anything. Outside the small window of the watchroom, the fog had settled fully around the tower. He could see very dim. The slow, pale shapes of the fog moving in the long bars of light from the lens above. He could not see the sea. He could not see the headland. He could not see the path he had walked up. He could see only the slow, pale, luminous fog, lit by his own lens. Turning. The foghorn below on the rocks made its long, slow note. Edmund opened the small leather notebook. He wrote in his small, careful hand, December the 12th. Fog. Lamp lit 428. Lens turning. Diaphone steady. Helen sent 2 cheese sandwiches in the thermos. Whittier still on page 73. The coast is quiet tonight. He closed the notebook. He set it on the desk. He took up the small copy of Whittier. He opened it to the page he had marked with a thin slip of paper. He had been reading, off and on for some weeks, the long poem Snowbound, in which Whittier described a New England farmhouse during a great snowstorm, with the family gathered around the hearth and the storm wailing outside. It was a long poem. Edmund read it slowly, only a few pages at a sitting. He liked it. He had grown up in Massachusetts before his family had moved west. And the New England winter Whittier described was a winter that was somewhere far back in his own first memories. He read. He read by the small, steady yellow of the watchroom lamp. He read. Every 20 seconds, in the slow rhythm of the pulses of light that came through the small window, from the lens above as it swept its beams across the fog outside. The light brightened, dimmed, brightened, dimmed, in the small, steady way it did all night long. Edmund did not notice it after a while. The body, after 19 years of these watches, simply ignored the rhythm. The body knew it was there. He read for perhaps an hour. The watchroom around him was very quiet. The kettle had come up some time before, and Edmund had not yet noticed, and the small whisper of steam from its spout had become, in the slow background of the room, part of the small, ordinary architecture of the watch. Outside the window, the fog had settled to its full thickness. Edmund could see, when he glanced up from the page, nothing of the world beyond the small lit fog directly outside the glass, which brightened and dimmed in the slow 20-second rhythm of the lens above. He glanced up. He went back to the page. He glanced up again. He read. Sometimes, on watches like this, he would let himself think. In the slow, soft way thoughts come on long, quiet nights, about the great chain of keepers who had stood at this same window, in this same watchroom, looking out at this same lit fog, since the tower had been built. There had been 12 head keepers at Yaquina Head. Since 1873, Edmund had been the seventh. The first had been a man named Higgins, who had served only 18 months before being moved to a station further north. The second had been a man named Bates, who had served 11 years and had retired to inland Oregon. The third had been a man named Robertson, who had drowned in the surf below the cliffs in 1884, in a circumstance never fully explained, and whom Edmund had never met, but whose name was carved with the others on the small wooden plaque inside the base door of the tower. Edmund had read the names many times. He had wondered sometimes about Robertson. He had not let the wondering become a heavy thing. It was a fact of the station. It would be a fact long after Edmund himself was gone. He had decided, somewhere in the long quiet of his middle years, that the long line of keepers at this station was a kind of company. He was not alone in the watchroom in any deep sense. He was the seventh of a count that had begun 50 years before he came, and would go on after he left. The light had been here longer than him. The light would be here longer than any of them. He liked this thought. He had thought it many times. After the hour, he set the book aside. He stood, and he stretched in the small, economical way of a man who has been sitting still for 60 minutes, and who does not really need to stretch, but who likes to do it anyway. He walked once around the small watchroom. He looked for a moment out the small window at the lit fog, and he thought again, in the small inward way he often thought it, that he had been very fortunate in his life, that he had been given work that was important, and that suited him, and that the work had given him in return a long quiet that had not been bored, and that few men, by his small reckoning, had as much. He sat back down. He took the second cup of coffee. He drank. After perhaps 10 minutes, the speaking tube from the base of the tower made its small, soft whistle. It was the small brass whistle on the tube that meant someone at the base wanted to talk to the watchroom. Edmund put his ear to it. Yes. Edmund. It was Carl, his assistant. I'm coming up. I'm not due until midnight, Carl. It's only 6. I know. Helen sent up a stew. I'm bringing it. All right. Come up. He capped the tube. He smiled. Helen was a remarkable woman. He waited. After perhaps 3 or 4 minutes, Carl's careful steps came up the iron stairs. Carl appeared at the door of the watchroom. He was perhaps 30, lean with the small, careful face of a young man who had grown up on this coast and had decided early that the life of a keeper suited him. He carried in one hand a small covered enameled tin pot. He carried in the other a folded white cloth that he had wrapped around the pot to keep it warm. "Stew," he said. "Bless her." Carl set the pot on the small bench beside the satchel. He unwrapped it. He took from his coat pocket a small bowl and a spoon, which he set on the desk. He had thought ahead. He had been Edmund's assistant for 2 years. He had become, over those 2 years, a thoroughly thoughtful young man. "How is the night?" he asked. "Quiet. Fog. Diaphone steady. Lens true. Good. I'll be up at midnight then." "At midnight. Good night, Edmund." "Good night, Carl." Carl touched the brim of his cap and went down the stairs. Edmund waited until his footsteps had faded down the spiral. Then he opened the pot. The stew was Helen's lamb stew, with the small, careful pieces of carrot and turnip, and the long-cooked tenderness of meat that had been on the back of her stove since noon. He ladled some into the bowl. He sat at the desk and ate, slowly, the way he ate all his meals now, looking now and then at the small window of the watchroom and at the slow turn of light against the fog outside. The foghorn called. The lens turned. He ate. When he had finished the bowl, he set it on the bench with the spoon across it. He poured the last of the thermos coffee into the tin cup. He drank. He sat for a long while without doing anything. He thought in the slow, soft way of a man at the late hour of a long watch. Of his daughter, Margaret, who lived now in Portland up the river, who had married a young man named Hollister 3 years ago, and who had a small son now of 1.5, named Edmund after him, whom he saw perhaps 4 times a year. He thought of Margaret growing up on this headland. running as a small girl down the path between the cottage and the tower, knowing every keeper's wife by name, knowing the small daily rhythms of a lighthouse station as her own childhood normal. She had loved it as a child. She had been ready to leave it by the time she was 18. He understood. He did not begrudge her. He thought of Helen, down in the cottage now, banking the small kitchen stove for the night, reading by the small lamp on the kitchen table. He thought of his father, long gone now, who had given him the brass lantern. He thought of these things in the small, slow way. Thoughts come on a long, quiet watch in a small, warm room above the long, quiet sea. He thought, too, of the small, particular way the light worked tonight. 2 flashes every 20 seconds was the Yaquina signature. Every coast had its own. Up at Tillamook Rock, 50 miles north, the light flashed once every 5 seconds. A faster pulse for the more dangerous water there. Down at Cape Blanco, far to the south, the light was steady white with no flash at all. Only the long, unbroken stare of its lamp. Every keeper on every coast knew the signatures of his neighbors. Edmund had been able to identify, in the long stretches of his evenings out on the headland in summer, the small distant pulse of Tillamook Rock, far to the north, as a faint regular glow on the horizon during the clear nights. He had not seen it tonight. The fog held it from him. But he knew it was there. He knew a man named Lawler was keeping it. He knew in the long, quiet way that light keepers know about each other, that Lawler had a daughter going off to teacher's college in Eugene next year. The lightkeepers' service was a small fraternity. They knew each other. He let his mind drift gentle to the small chain of lights running up and down this coast. Tillamook Rock to the north, Cape Meares, Yaquina Head where he sat, Hesida Head just south, Umpqua River, Cape Arago, Cape Blanco at the south. Each was a small lit point on the long dark of the Pacific coast. Each kept by 1 or 2 men. Each turning its own signature out into the fog or the rain or the clear night. Each saving in the small, steady way these lights saved. The ships that ran past in the dark. The thought of it pleased him. The whole coast was being kept tonight. He was part of the keeping. He shifted, slow in the chair, He poured a small last measure from the second cup of coffee. He drank. He thought then of the small house in Newport down the coast, where his daughter Margaret had been born 19 years ago. He thought of the small kitchen of that house, where Helen had cooked their evening meals for the first years of their marriage, before they had been moved up here to Yaquina Head. He thought of how Margaret, as a small child of 3, had watched through the kitchen window of that Newport house the long, slow turn of the Yaquina light far to the north across the bay every clear evening, before she even knew her father would one day be the keeper of it. He thought of how strange a thing that was. A small girl in a small town, watching a light 15 miles up the coast every evening, not knowing the light would be hers in a way, for 19 years of her growing up. He thought of all the small, unknown ways things become themselves. The fog held. The lens turned. The foghorn called. Outside the small window, the fog held its slow, patient way around the headland. Edmund picked up the book of Whittier again. He read another page. He read another. He read until perhaps 11 o'clock, when his eyes began to do the slow, heavy thing they did now, in the late hour of a watch. He marked the page. He closed the book. He set it aside. He went, slow, up through the hatch to the lamp room. He checked the wick. The wick was burning clean. He checked the level in the small auxiliary kerosene reservoir. It was good. He looked for one long moment at the slow turn of the great Fresnel lens around him, at the long, soft, luminous fans of light moving outward into the fog. And he gave the lens, in the small, private way he sometimes did, the small inward nod of a man who has worked alongside a thing for 19 years. He came back down. He sat in the watchroom. He looked out the small window. He listened in the small inward way to the slow, regular rhythm of the foghorn, which had become, over the hours, almost the rhythm of his own breath. At midnight, Carl's small, careful footsteps came up the stairs again. Carl appeared at the door, dressed now in his thicker nightcoat, with his own small thermos of coffee in one hand and his own small leather satchel of personal items in the other. "Edmund," he said. Carl. Anything? Quiet. Fog held all night. Diaphone steady. Wick I trimmed at 9. All right. I have her. Carl set down his things. Edmund packed up his own. He folded the cloth that had wrapped Helen's stew pot, and he set the pot inside the satchel, and he set the bowl and spoon in their pocket. He took up his cap. He put it on. He paused at the door of the watchroom. Helen's still up. Lamps on in the kitchen. I saw it as I came up the path. All right. Good night, Carl. Good night, Edmund. He went slow down the long iron spiral of the tower. The descent was always a different thing than the climb. The hand on the rail was different. The legs were different. The body at the end of a long, quiet watch had the slow, honest tiredness of a watch completed. He reached the base. He put on the oilskin coat. He took up the brass lantern. He lit it from the small lamp on the desk. The lantern came up with its small, steady yellow flame. He stepped out of the iron door and pulled it closed behind him and locked it. The fog outside was thicker now than it had been when he came up. He held the lantern at the height of his hip. The lantern made a small yellow circle around him, perhaps 3 feet across. And beyond that circle, the world was the slow, pale, luminous gray of fog, lit from above by the lens of his tower. He could see every 20 seconds the slow, soft brightening of the fog as one of the lens fans passed over the headland, and then the small dimming back to the ordinary luminous gray. He walked. The path back was the same path. He knew it. He let his feet find their own way. He thought as he walked of the warm kitchen of the cottage waiting for him. He thought of Helen. He thought of the small wood stove, which would be banked low but still warm, and the small kettle that would still be on it, half full in case he wanted tea before bed. He thought of the bed itself, the iron bedstead with the wool blankets, the small lamp on the bedside table that Helen would have left burning low. He walked, slow, through the fog. The cottage came into view as a small, soft, warm yellow square of light, very far off, then nearer still. He reached the small gate of the yard. He opened it. He walked up the small stone path to the door. He stood for a moment on the porch, knocking the dust of the path off his boots in the small way he always did. He pushed the door open. The warm, dry air of the kitchen came out to meet him. Helen was at the kitchen table. She had a small piece of mending in her lap, and the small lamp on the table burned low. She looked up at him as he came in. She smiled in the small, soft way she smiled when he came home. "Quiet," she said. "Quiet. Tea?" "No. Just bed." "All right." He hung the oilskin on the peg by the door. He set the lantern on the small table beside the door, where it could cool. He set the satchel on the bench. He went to the table. He bent down. He kissed Helen on the top of her head. She set the mending aside. "I banked the bedroom stove low," she said. "It should still be warm." "All right. Come up when you're ready. I'll be up in 5 minutes." He went, slow in the way he went everywhere now, through the small narrow door from the kitchen into the bedroom. The bedroom was warm with the small, slow heat of the banked stove in the corner. The lamp on the bedside table burned low. The bed was turned down. He undressed in the small, careful way he always undressed. He folded the trousers across the chair. He folded the shirt across them. He kept the union suit and the wool socks. He sat on the edge of the bed. He let his head rest in his hands for a small moment. He was tired. It was an honest tired. He liked it. He lay back. He pulled the blankets up. The bed had been his bed for 14 years. It had been Helen's bed, too. The mattress had the small, soft, yielding shape of 2 long lives lying in it together. He closed his eye. Above him, far above, his lens kept turning. He could not see it from the bed, but he knew it. He knew it in the way a man knows the working of a thing he has worked alongside for a long time. The lens was turning. The lamp was burning. The fans of light were going out across the fog. Again, again, again. In the long, patient rhythm of the clockwork. Carl was up there now, in the watchroom, drinking his own coffee, listening to the same slow foghorn that Edmund had been listening to all evening. The work was going on. The work would go on through the night. It would go on without him now. His shoulders, which had carried the small, unconscious tensions of the long watch, let them go. His hands let them go. His jaw let them go. His belly beneath the warm wool of the blanket settled. Helen came in from the kitchen, soft in her slippers. She undressed in her own small, careful way at the small mirror by the window. She blew the lamp out. She came to the bed. She lay down beside him. She did not speak. She knew after 14 years that he was already most of the way to sleep. She simply set her small warm hand against his arm under the blanket, and she settled. He turned very slight in the bed. He drew her hand a small distance closer. He held it. His thoughts slowed. They became no longer thoughts, but only the gentle drift of one thing into another. The path up, the base door, the barometer reading 30.02, the slow climb of the iron spiral, the lit wick, the first turn of the lens. The fog lit up around the tower. The slow, steady cycle of the foghorn down on the rocks. Carl coming up with the stew. Whittier on page 76. The walk down. The small yellow circle of the brass lantern. The light of the kitchen window across the fog of the headland. Helen at the table with the mending. Her hand now against his arm. He let it pass over him. He let it pass over him again. The lens kept turning above the fog. The foghorn kept its slow, steady call from the rocks. The fog held its long, patient way around the headland and around the cottage and around the small wood-frame bedroom in which Edmund lay, 51 years old, tired and warm and not afraid, drifting gently down into the deep, easy quiet of sleep. The lens turned. The foghorn called. The fog held. And somewhere up the tower in the warm watchroom, Carl drank his coffee and watched the slow, soft turn of the great Fresnel lens above him. And the long Pacific night went on around the Oregon headland. And Edmund slept. And Helen slept beside him. And the night kept being the night. And that was all. And now, few quiet words to carry into sleep. You are safe. You are warm. The day is done. Nothing more is asked of you tonight. The room around you holds you gently. The bed beneath you holds you fully. Your body knows how to rest. Your mind may let go now. The long quiet is here. Sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet, sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet.